If you watch this channel long enough, you're going to realize that we're going to be visiting a lot of cemeteries and burial grounds. And today I'm at my absolute favorite one in Boston, Massachusetts, called Granary Burying Grounds. As you can see, it's not very large, but there are a ton of historical figures buried here. Now let's go learn something. Established in 1660, the Granary Burying Grounds are the city of Boston's third oldest cemetery. It is one of the stops on the famous Freedom Trail that highlights 16 landmarks important to the early history and founding of the United States. After the nearby King's Chapel Burying Ground became overcrowded with internments, land from the Boston Common was set aside to become a new burying ground. The name Granary comes from an old grain storage house that once stood next door where the historic Park Street Church stands today. Today, the Granary is the most visited historic cemetery in the Northeast, attracting over 1 million visitors annually. As we enter through the gates of the cemetery, we will start in the very center to pay our respects to a very important family. This large obelisk, smack dab in the middle, is the Franklin family tomb. Although the brilliant founding father, Benjamin Franklin, is buried in Philadelphia, this plot here contains the remains of his parents, Josiah and Abiah. This obelisk was placed here in 1827 to replace an older marker, but the inscription on it is in the words of Benjamin Franklin himself. Also interred here is the uncle of Benjamin Franklin, also named Benjamin, who the founding father is named after. Now we're going to continue by going clockwise from the front gate, along the left side of the burial ground, and stop at the grave of lawyer and patriot James Otis. If you have ever heard somebody utter the phrase, "taxation without representation is tyranny," they're quoting James Otis. Otis is best known for arguing against British writs of assistance, which allowed customs officers to search for smuggled or stolen goods without a warrant. Otis gave a 5-hour-long speech condemning the order at the Old State House in February 1761. This gave much-needed legitimacy to the Revolution movement. Years later, founding father John Adams would write, "Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there the child independence was born. The seeds of patriots and heroes were then and there sown." Otis would have been one of the leaders of the Revolution, but sadly, as the 1760s progressed, Otis's mental health began to decline rapidly. In 1769, James Otis criticized some local customs commissioners, and one of the men confronted him the next day. Otis ended up being struck in the head during the altercation, and it's thought that this caused his mental health to deteriorate even more. Today we know that he likely suffered from bipolar disorder, but at the time he was viewed as a madman. He passed away in 1783 after being struck by a bolt of lightning. As we make our way around, our next stop is the monument dedicated to the one and only John Hancock. John Hancock might be known best for his large signature at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, but at the time of the Revolution, he was one of the wealthiest men in the 13 colonies. Hancock was orphaned after the death of his father, and he was adopted by his wealthy uncle. When his uncle passed away, he inherited the family shipping business. Now a rich business owner, Hancock was strongly against the taxes being imposed by the Crown and began to speak out against British influence in the colonies. Eventually, Hancock would become president of the Continental Congress and the first as well as the third governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He was even a candidate for president of the United States, but only secured 4 out of the 138 electoral votes and finished behind John Adams and George Washington. Hancock died on October 8, 1793, at the age of 56, and was buried right here in the Granary. When Hancock was buried, it's said that he was interred wearing his best jewelry, including some valuable rings. Legend says that grave robbers dug up his body and tried to remove the rings. When they couldn't, they cut off Hancock's hands instead. Another legend says that John Hancock's body was lost after a nearby wall was being renovated. Neither of these stories have been confirmed, so John Hancock's remains may or may not still be here. Nobody seems to know. Also buried in this plot is John Hancock's servant, simply known as Frank, who passed away on January 23, 1771. Because there is no last name inscribed on the headstone, sadly we can assume with almost certainty that Frank was a slave. A slave being buried in the same plot as his owner is very rare, and likely means that the Hancock family held him in high regard. Today, Frank's grave attracts a lot of visitors who sometimes leave coins and other small gifts. The next stop is the grave of Peter Faneuil. Faneuil was a local philanthropist and benefactor of Boston's nearby market and meeting hall called Faneuil Hall, that still bears his name today. It is also another stop on the Freedom Trail. Faneuil is a bit of a controversial figure in the history of Boston. Having been known for using his wealth to give back to the city, he was also a slave trader and owned a handful of slaves himself. He died in 1743 of edema. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. We're now at the very rear of the Granary to pay our respects to one of the great heroes of the American Revolution, Paul Revere. A silversmith by trade, Revere was born right here in Boston and is best known for his famous midnight ride to warn the local militia of the approach of British troops prior to the battles of Lexington and Concord. Revere was sort of a jack of all trades. He worked mainly as a silversmith, but also did work as a blacksmith, a courier, a dentist, and even an engraver. In fact, if you've ever seen the famous depiction of the Boston Massacre, that was actually engraved by Paul Revere. It was based off of a drawing by a man named Henry Pelham. He was also a participant in the Boston Tea Party. In April 1775, after hearing of a large amount of munitions in Concord, British General Thomas Gage planned to have his troops set out to seize the stockpile. When Revere heard of this, he crossed the river into Charlestown and had Robert Newman light a signal lantern in the Old North Church to alert him if the British began to move. 1 lantern if by land and 2 if by sea. Now, there are a few misconceptions about this event that we're going to clear up real quick. Firstly, Revere was not the only man making this ride. In fact, he was joined by another man named William Dawes, and later by a man named Samuel Prescott. Secondly, Paul Revere never said the British are coming. He likely said something more in line with the regulars are out. Keep in mind that in 1775, everyone was considered British, so saying the British are coming doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Revere arrived in Lexington around midnight and met with Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying the night at a relative of Hancock's. After some discussion, Revere convinced Hancock and Adams to flee as the troops approached. On the way to Concord, Revere, Dawes, and Prescott were detained by a British Army patrol. William Dawes escaped but fell off his horse and couldn't complete the ride. Samuel Prescott escaped into the woods and rode on to Concord to finish the ride, and Revere was captured and questioned, but eventually released. The militia in Lexington would engage the British Army and officially start the Revolutionary War in an event called the Shot Heard Around the World. From Paul Revere's grave, we turn and face the street and see the grave of Samuel Sewall. Samuel Sewall was one of the judges who presided over the Salem witch trials. In 1692, Massachusetts Governor Sir William Phips appointed Sewall as judge of the witch trials, and over the next year he would find 20 people guilty of witchcraft and sentence them to death. Later on, he would accept the fact that witchcraft did not exist and would apologize publicly for his role in the witch trials. After his death in 1730, his diary would be published, and to this day serves as a great reference for early Puritan life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A little further down the path, we come to this grave with the name Mary Goose on it. This is the Goose family burial plot, and somewhere in this vicinity, in an unmarked grave, lies Elizabeth Goose, who some think is the inspiration for Mother Goose. Now stay with me because it gets confusing. Mary Goose, whose name is on the headstone, was the wife of Isaac Goose. When Mary passed away, Isaac married a woman named Elizabeth. Elizabeth had a daughter also named Elizabeth, who married a local publisher named Thomas Fleet. In 1720, Thomas Fleet supposedly published a collection of nursery rhymes made up by his mother-in-law, Elizabeth Goose. A copy of this book has never been found, so it is highly unlikely that this story is true. There is also evidence that the moniker Mother Goose was used in France during the 17th century, so although Elizabeth is likely not the original Mother Goose, her grave, or rather Mary's grave, is one of the most visited in the entire burying ground. Our next stop is the grave of another founding father and Declaration of Independence signer, Robert Treat Paine. He was a Harvard graduate, lawyer, and politician, serving as the state of Massachusetts' first Attorney General. He also served as a justice on the Massachusetts Supreme Court. In 1770, Paine was the prosecutor in the trial against Captain Thomas Preston and his men after the Boston Massacre, going up against a defense team led by John Adams. As our tour of the granary winds down, let's stop at the grave of another important founding father, Samuel Adams. Not just the namesake of a popular Boston beer, Samuel Adams was an immensely important figure in Revolutionary America. He was one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, a Harvard graduate, was the cousin of John Adams, and signed the Declaration of Independence. He was known for being an inspirational force for the cause of the Patriots because of his fiery opposition to British occupation. In fact, it was said that Hancock's money and Adams' political influence is what mainly funded and inspired the revolutionary movement in the 1770s. On December 16, 1773, Sam Adams incited the Boston Tea Party after giving a dramatic speech to his fellow patriots at the Old South Meeting House just blocks away from here. After this meeting, Boston residents raided 3 British ships carrying East India Company tea and destroyed the cargo by throwing it overboard into Boston Harbor. Today, a statue of Samuel Adams stands outside of Faneuil Hall, not far from where the Boston Tea Party took place. Although nowadays he is known to most people as a mascot for Samuel Adams' Boston Lager, few people played as pivotal a role in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War as Samuel Adams. Our very last stop is the common burial plot for Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr. These are the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre. I'm not going to get into great detail about the event itself because that's a whole video in of itself. Instead, I'm going to focus on the victims themselves. Crispus Attucks was an African-American sailor working in Boston at the time of the Boston Massacre. He is said to be the very first person out of the 5 to die. Samuel Gray was a local rope maker who was also known for being a tough, hard-nosed man and was often getting into fights with British soldiers. Gray had a strong distaste for British occupation and is said to have been one of the main instigators of the massacre. According to witness accounts, he was the first to be fired upon. He died a short time later. James Caldwell was a 17-year-old who worked as a sailor for a ship called Hawk. He was not from Boston, however, and not much is known about him beyond that. He was killed by 2 musket balls in his back, and since he had no family in the area, his body was placed in Faneuil Hall along with Crispus Attucks before burial. Samuel Maverick, another 17-year-old, was wounded after finding himself in the middle of the altercation. He was having dinner at a friend's house nearby when they heard commotion outside. Thinking it was a fire, they met up with the crowd at the customs house and got separated. Maverick ended up making his way to the front of the crowd, near the cornered British soldiers, and was shot in the stomach when the gunfire broke out. He passed away the next morning. The final Boston Massacre victim was Patrick Carr. He was an Irish immigrant and worked in the leather business in 1770. On the night of the incident, he heard a commotion in the street, like Samuel Maverick, and went outside to investigate. He was wounded as he was crossing the street with a friend. The ball hit him in the abdomen, and he passed away 4 days later. Carr did not blame the soldiers for what had happened because he felt that they acted in self-defense, much to the chagrin of Samuel Adams, who used the Boston Massacre as an opportunity to push more anti-British rhetoric. There is one more person buried in this plot, somebody just as important but not as well known. 12-year-old Christopher Snyder, or Cider. At the time of 1770, the citizens of Boston were boycotting certain British imports because of the taxes being imposed by Parliament. A local shop owner named Theophilus Lilly was a loyalist and did not participate in the boycott. This made him very unpopular in town. Protesters put up a large sign outside the shop that read "Importer." A man by the name of Ebenezer Richardson, who was also a loyalist and thought to be a British informant, attempted to take the sign down. A group of young boys began to heckle Richardson, throwing stones and ice as they chased him back to his home. A crowd formed outside and began to hurl stones and other debris through his windows. Some were even said to have struck Richardson's wife. Scared for his life, Richardson reached for his musket and fired one shot into the crowd, hitting 12-year-old Christopher Snyder. Snyder died later that night. This is the event that rose tensions to a fever pitch just days before the Boston Massacre. In Paul Revere's engraved image of the massacre, you can see a reference to this event in the background, showing a musket being aimed and fired out of a window. That just about does it for our tour of the Granary Burying Ground. If you ever find yourself in Boston, you owe it to yourself to tour the Freedom Trail and visit this spot and see where so many important people in our country's founding are laid to rest. I highly recommend taking an entire day to stop and appreciate this and so many other historical landmarks in downtown Boston, like the Old South Meeting House and the Old State House where the Boston Massacre actually took place. I will leave a link in the description to the Freedom Trail's website where you can make a donation to help preserve the sites so that future generations can enjoy them for years to come. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We're also on Instagram at searching4history. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.